A teenage girl writes a letter in her room before leaving the house. By then, dawn has already arrived. She quietly sits and waits for the sun to rise. In her letter, she reveals that she can no longer bear living forever as a teenager. Moments later, she burns to a crisp as the first rays of sunlight touch her. In this world, everyone is a vampire, following a global outbreak. Even coffee stands sell different blood types to their customers. Beggars starve for blood, while children casually hang out at night as if it's completely normal. However, immortality comes at a terrible cost. Those who can no longer afford blood gradually lose control, eventually transforming into monstrous creatures driven purely by instinct. Meanwhile, humanity is on the brink of extinction as vampires continue hunting and farming them for blood. Despite all that, some vampires still choose to protect humanity. One of them is Edward Dalton, who works at Bromley Marks, a pharmaceutical company developing a substitute for human blood. During a meeting, the police commissioner explains the growing threat of Subsiders, revealing that vampires who suffer from blood deprivation completely lose their emotions and ability to think rationally. He urges Bromley Marks to find a solution as soon as possible. As the discussion continues, Edward sarcastically remarks that they are all heading toward extinction. In response, Charles Bromley asks Edward to meet him in his office. There, he reveals that he was once diagnosed with cancer. But becoming a vampire gave him a second chance at life, but his daughter refused to be turned and left with the others. He then urges Edward to begin the test immediately, knowing he still sympathizes with humans after noticing he never touched his coffee. Moments later, he begins testing the blood substitute on a vampire test subject inside the operating theater, where several executives observe the experiment from the gallery above. At first, the subject feels nothing when Edward asks how he's doing. However, as the test continues, he suddenly vomits, begins twitching violently, and his body starts to swell. So he immediately orders the team to stabilize him, but soon after, the subject explodes, proving that the experiment has failed. On his way home, Edward notices that his ears are beginning to change as well. Distracted, he nearly crashes into another car, sending it skidding to a stop, while he barely avoids slamming into a roadblocker. Shortly after, he gets out to check on the occupants, only to be shot in the hand by Audrey Bennett. That's when he realizes they're all human. Knowing the police are on their way, Edward offers to help, hides them inside his car, activates its day mode. When the police arrive, he points them in the opposite direction. Inside the car, Audrey learns his name and where he works. Once the police leave, she parts ways with him after telling Edward they'll meet again. Back at home, he is watering his plants when the back door suddenly opens. It turns out to be his younger brother, Frankie Dalton, returning from his latest assignment with a birthday gift. When Edward opens it, he discovers it's pure human blood, so Frankie prepares a glass filled with ice. However, when he offers it to him, he refuses, saying he doesn't drink human blood, prompting Frankie to make a sarcastic remark. Before long, the two start arguing, eventually leading Edward to pour the blood down the kitchen sink. Furious, Frankie smashes the bottle against the wall. Just then, a Subsider suddenly appears, putting both of them on edge. However, it ignores them, and instead walks toward the blood splattered on the wall. Hearing someone approaching, it instinctively threatens them, but it gets distracted once again by the glass filled with blood. Seizing the opportunity, Frankie quickly grabs a knife, but he sends him flying into the wall, knocking him out, leaving Edward to defend himself with nothing but a chair while calling out to his brother. Frankie soon recovers, grabs the knife, and they attack together. However, the Subsider evades them. Then, Frankie skillfully wounds it several times before finally decapitating it. Not long after, the police arrive and begin investigating the incident. It turns out to be his gardener, as the police identify him by the name engraved on his ring. That's when she notices he has bitten his own hand, accelerating his mutation. Later that day, while Edward is asleep, he wakes up after hearing the back door open again, so he goes to investigate and finds Audrey asking for his help. There, she hands him a map before leaving. After returning inside, Edward is surprised to find his brother waiting for him on the stairs. Later that night, he stares at the map, debating whether he should go. Eventually, he decides to visit the location the next day. There, Audrey tells him that someone wants to meet him. After parking beneath a large tree, he steps out of the car and carefully makes his way through the area, making sure the sunlight filtering through the leaves doesn't touch him. There, he meets Lionel Elvis Cormack. After introducing himself, he grabs Edward's hand and places it against his chest, revealing that he was once a vampire. Suddenly, they hear a click and turn to see Audrey being held at gunpoint by Frankie. So he tries to persuade his brother to stand down, but when they notice Frankie backup arriving, Audrey shoves into the sunlight while he's distracted, allowing Elvis to knock him unconscious with a punch. However, just as they are about to leave, their car is riddled with gunfire, so they quickly switch to Edward's car and immediately drive off. Moments later, a military vehicle catches up and opens fire, allowing sunlight to enter the car. That's when they manage to shoot out all of the vehicle's cameras, forcing Elvis to take the wheel. Using only a small opening to see the road ahead, he does his best to lose the pursuers through the woods. During the chase, sunlight strikes Edward's face. Not long after, they come across a broken bridge, so they force their way across. Luckily, they bring down the support beams in the process, preventing the pursuers from following them. By nightfall, they finally arrive at a safe location, where Elvis explains how he became human again. Earlier that day, while driving at high speed, his lack of blood clouded his mind, causing him to lose focus and crash. The impact threw him from the vehicle, and he caught fire before landing in a river, which saved his life. When he woke up, he had turned back into a human. That's when Edward realized that the sun is the cure for vampirism, before asking Edward to recreate the same process safely. Meanwhile, back at the office, Charles looks at a photo of his daughter as his assistant brings Frankie into the room. There, he tries to persuade him to bring Edward back so he can continue his work. At that moment, Edward is more focused on Audrey's neck than on what she's saying. Noticing this, she asks him to pull over before cutting her hand and pouring the blood into a cup, telling him to drink since he's beginning to turn. Before long, they arrive at the safe house, where Audrey introduces him to Jarvis, who is responsible for picking up other survivors and bringing them there. Inside, Edward sees dozens of humans busy working and begins questioning how they're able to stay safe. However, as Elvis explains, in the world they live in now, no human is truly safe. Eventually, he meets Senator Wes Turner. Although everyone there hates vampires, she explains that the senator is their link to those searching for a cure, as humanity is on the brink of extinction. Meanwhile, Charles watches as more human blood suppliers are withdrawn by investors due to the dwindling human population. Across the city, more and more vampires begin starving. At a nearby coffee stand, a customer asks for more blood, but the attendant explains that they can only serve drinks containing around 5% blood. Frustrated, he pressures the attendant, but she simply can't give him any more. So he grabs one of the blood bags hanging behind the counter, and the two begin struggling over it until it suddenly bursts. Instantly, instinct takes over, sending the crowd into a frenzy and forcing the police to step in. Even then, everyone continues fighting over the blood spilled across the ground, including the attendant behind the counter. Back at the safe house, Edward begins working by taking blood samples from Elvis while asking him a series of questions as he examines the blood under a microscope. Afterward, he steps outside, but everyone seems afraid of him and quickly walks away. Audrey soon joins him, and the two chat for a while. That's when Edward notices some kind of large tank, prompting Audrey to explain what they're for. After inspecting the inside, they begin modifying it by installing a sight glass on its wall and cutting an opening to allow sunlight to enter. Meanwhile, Jarvis leads a convoy transporting survivors back to the safe house. Among them is Allison Bromley, Charles Bromley's daughter. Suddenly, one of the vehicle's tires is punctured, forcing the convoy to stop as everyone turns on their lights. When Jarvis checks the tire, he discovers a tranquilizer dart. Realizing it's an ambush, everyone immediately goes on alert. However, enemies emerge from both sides, overwhelming them with sheer numbers and making any resistance futile. At that moment, while working on the tank, they receive a distress call from Allison. However, the transmission suddenly cuts off after she's tranquilized by the soldiers. They then begin tracking their location. Knowing they've been compromised, the group starts evacuating everyone from the safe house. However, Edward refuses to leave, believing this may be their only chance to complete the experiment. As a result, the three of them decide to stay behind. Moments later, Allison wakes up in an unfamiliar room. Looking around, she spots a knife and quickly grabs it. Before long, Charles arrives and embraces his daughter. However, after telling her he couldn't save her friends, Allison angrily tries to leave. That's when he realizes he's been stabbed. But as the elevator opens, a soldier knocks her unconscious. The following morning, the group prepares to begin the experiment. They attach a heart monitor to Edward's chest before directing sunlight into the tank, working against the clock. Wet towels are placed over his body as Elvis and Audrey prepare to carry out their respective roles. Once everything is ready, he opens the small window, causing Edward's body to burn. After a few moments, Audrey opens the vent. However, the heart monitor shows no heartbeat. They try once more, but although the monitor briefly reacts, it soon goes flat. Just as the army closes in on the house, they attempt the experiment one final time. At first, the monitor remains still, but moments later, a heartbeat finally appears. That's when Edward feels himself breathing once again. And when Audrey checks on him, his pupils have returned to those of a human. Soon after, the army storms into the house. However, the three of them are no longer inside the fermentation tank. Instead, they're hiding inside a large wine vat. Although one of the soldiers inspects it, he eventually walks away. At that moment, Charles summons Frankie once again, asking for his help. Not long after, Frankie visits Allison and bites her, turning her into a vampire as well. Not long after the army leaves, the trio finally emerges from their hiding place, allowing Edward to feel the warmth of the sun once again. Meanwhile, Charles stares at the now empty blood supply before making his way to Allison's room. When he enters, he finds her drinking her own blood, then immediately grabs her father, demanding that he take responsibility for what happened until the guards pull her away. At the same time, the military launches a citywide operation to eliminate the rapidly growing Subsider population caused by the dwindling blood supply. One by one, the Subsiders are dragged into the sunlight and burned alive. One of them is Allison. As she's dragged into the sunlight, she grabs hold of Frankie, forcing him to face what he has done. Once outside, she turns to look at him as her body burns to a crisp. After visiting the senator's cabin, only to find that every survivor has been killed, including the senator, they heads to Christopher, Edward's co-worker, hoping he'll help them develop the cure. However, they soon realize he's secretly calling for backup. At the same time, Audrey, who had gone to check on him, is already captured by the army. Moments later, soldiers storm the building, but they manages to escape through an underground tunnel before making their way back to Elvis's old workshop. But they soon realize someone is following them. To their surprise, it's Frankie. That's when he discovers his brother has truly become human. Edward once again tries to persuade him, prompting Frankie to finally reveal why he turned him into a vampire in the first place. Eventually, Frankie agrees to help them. However, when Elvis gets too close, his instincts suddenly take over and he bites him. So, Edward immediately shoves him away and points a crossbow at him. That's when he notices that something is wrong with his brother. Shortly afterward, Edward heads to Bromley Marks alone and surrenders himself. Moments later, he's brought back into Charles's office, where Audrey sits on a sofa with tourniquets strapped around both of her arms as blood slowly drains from her hands, where he begins pleading with Charles to turn him back into a vampire. In exchange, he'll hand over the formula to repopulate the human race. However, Charles shows little interest because, not long before, Christopher successfully developed the blood substitute. He then reveals his true motive before mocking him. Even so, when Edward brings up his daughter, he loses his temper and bites him in the neck. That's when it becomes clear that, after biting Elvis, Frankie had turned back into a human. Naturally, the same thing happens to Charles, who suddenly collapses to the floor, twitching in pain. Yet, he still manages to call for security. In response, Edward quickly blocks the door with a piece of a broken chair. Before long, the army arrives. Just as they are about to head for the emergency stairs, the elevator doors open. Standing inside is Charles, now fully human and tied to a chair. Without hesitation, the soldiers lunge at him, drinking his blood before tearing him apart. At the same time, Edward and Audrey reach the hallway, only to find a group of soldiers blocking their path. Suddenly, a car crashes into the hallway, and the driver steps out before taking down the soldiers one by one. Even so, more troops soon arrive, quickly surrounding him. Realizing there's no way out, he tells them to run. Moments later, the soldiers swarm him and begin feeding on his blood. Meanwhile, Audrey is pulled into a nearby room. Luckily, Edward manages to force his way inside before killing every security guard in the room. Not long after, the soldiers begin turning back into humans one by one, only to be devoured by the remaining vampires. The cycle continues until they finally step outside, where only 3 people remain. Unexpectedly, they are all shot by Christopher, who reveals that he has no intention of allowing the cure for vampirism to exist. However, at that very moment, a crossbow bolt suddenly pierces his chest before exploding. By then, Edward finally gets the chance to see his brother one last time. Then, as dawn approaches, the trio leave together, heading toward the rising sun.